Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm making this biology review to help you guys clarify some concepts that may be confusing for you in the lecture. It's going to be very quick. Let's just jump right in. So what are neurons? This is a concept that we're going to talk about a lot in the class. We probably have already started. Neurons are cells, and this is an idea we're going to come back to explaining what cells are later in this slideshow. They were previously called nerve cells. I called them that a few times in the PowerPoint presentation. That's why I mention it here, but for the most part, we use the term neurons. Neurons are the smallest units of the nervous system, meaning that if I were to look at the brain under the microscope, I would see neurons. If I were to zoom in as much as I can, I would see neurons. And also, I want to point out here, the reason why we call them nerve cells is because if I were to look at the nerves in our body, like in our, the things that give sensation to the hands and the rest of our skin, you would see nerves are really just bundles of neurons. So that may be a good way to think of it to help you remember. And this is a basic structure of a neuron here. Yeah. And we'll go into this much more in class. So we'll talk about that later. Don't worry about it right now. So what is a cell? We said neurons are cells. So what is a cell exactly? You're probably wondering. You may remember a basic animal cell or a plant cell, as you talk about in like high school bio or an intro bio class. A cell is the basic unit of life in all living organisms. So all organisms can be bacteria, dogs, humans, all organisms and trees, different plants too, have cells. And this is a picture of a cell here. And this is a picture of a cell here. I think you can see my pink cursor. And you may remember this picture from high school biology, whatever last bio class you've taken. I'm not asking you to memorize this structure here. I just want you to recognize it and realize that this is a cell and it may jive a memory for you. So, like I said, some organisms can be bacteria, which have one cell. Their whole body is just a single cell like this here, or made up of millions of cells like humans, okay? And cells can have distinct shapes and functions. So we have different looks to them. Some look like this, like a generic basic animal cell, and some look like neurons, like we saw here. And a neuron is a cell. So this is just one type of cell. A neuron is just one type of cell. And then there's also hair cells, which are involved in producing sound in the ear. And this whole thing is just one cell. So you can tell it actually has a complicated little structure, very different from like the basic animal cell. And all cells contain DNA. So we'll get into what that means in the next couple of slides. So like I said, neurons are cells. Just to give you a little more evidence, here's an animal cell on the left and a neuron on the right. And as you can see here, the animal cell has all these different, organelles in it, like the nucleus, and so does the neuron. This is zooming in at the soma. You can see the different parts of the neuron here. The part that we're focusing on is the soma, or the cell body, and that's where the nucleus, the mitochondria, and all that information, all that stuff is stored. Same thing like an animal cell. So that tells us that neurons are cells. Also, I'm sorry if you can hear my dog snoring in the back. Okay. So I said that all cells have DNA. Okay, so DNA, you may have heard this term before, is the genetic information in every cell in our body. And interestingly, every cell in the body has the same code throughout all of the cells. So this is a picture of the DNA here. And you can see it has like this strand, this like spiral structure, and these little bands in the middle, which are the nucleotides or the bases, you may remember them being called. And so DNA is the genetic information that tells all of our cells in the body what to do and when. Okay, so each cell, like I said, has the same genetic information, and this is kept in chromosomes in the nucleus of each cell. And then we're going to go into that later, so don't worry too much about that right this second. So each cell throughout the body has the same exact DNA, okay? So hair cells, skin cells, nerve cells all have the same genetic code, but they're each turned on at different times and made to have different structures and different functions. And so how does that happen, right? That's what we're going to talk about. And so what really happens, we'll talk about this, is that the DNA specifically is expressed at different times and at different amounts depending on what's needed in the body. You know, some parts of the body need neuron cells, some parts of the body need skin cells. And so we'll talk about how that happens. And this code, what's, you know, if we went, you know, do we have a skin cell in the brain or a neuron growing out of our hand, is determined by the coding of the DNA and proteins, which we'll talk about more later. Here's a little diagram showing what I meant when I said a cell has a nucleus, which has a chromosome, which contains the DNA. This is exactly what we're seeing here. We have a cell that if you zoomed in and looked at the nucleus under the microscope, you would see a nucleus with these little blue things inside, the X's, which are chromosomes. If I looked at the chromosome, one specific chromosome, and I zoomed in on like a little part, I would see like this whole thing is all DNA. If I looked at one specific part, I'd see one specific gene. I have another picture showing that this is a little bacteria guy here, a fungi, but no, not fungi, that's just a joke. But so we have a nucleus right here. We zoomed in from there. We took the nucleus out, just looking at that. And say we look at one specific little chromosome. And we then look at this particular section of the chromosome. We see a specific sequence of DNA known as a gene. And interestingly, you know, we all share 99% of our genetic code. So that means that there's very little variation in humans. So a lot of it is not really, you know, differences in specifically the genes that we're seeing from person to person and, you know, in different parts of the body and whatever, but instead we're seeing differences in this process, okay? And this process here is basically how DNA is like translated or read into proteins. So we have this process that you probably may have heard of in biology, transcription and translation, which are just two steps to reading the DNA and interpreting it in a way that each specific cell needs. Okay, and so the things that are involved in these processes that tell the cell, like, well, I need you to do this, okay, are the proteins. And they're not the kind you eat. We're not talking about the macros. We're talking about a molecule that is actually the output of DNA expression, like we see here. So the whole process results in these protein molecules. And proteins actually have many different functions throughout the body. If there's any sort of action in the body, it's usually done by a protein, like breaking down, you know, things in the stomach, or the you know, like what actually takes the oxygen to, you know, when involved in like, you know, in the blood transfer and stuff throughout the body. The thing that actually takes oxygen are proteins. So proteins have a lot of different roles. Or in the brain, for instance, the things that tell neurons when to stop and start functioning, proteins. So proteins are these molecules that go on to help DNA and tells DNA when it should work and how it should work and regulates the expression, meaning like when it gets turned on and used. And each cell type, like each different type of cell, actually uses specific proteins at specific times and specific amounts. There's so many different types of proteins in the body. I don't even know if we can count them. And so these specific types of proteins are used by specific cell types. Okay, so like when neurons are growing, when a baby's born versus an adult human, have very different different proteins that help with the neurons. And so this is basically like, if you want to know the nitty gritty of it, here's amino acids. They're very, you know, they're just a molecule. You can look up the chemical structure of them if you want. And then they like form together to make these proteins. So proteins are just molecules that are made through this process. And then DNA and proteins work together, and specifically in the brain, to inform how neurons work. So each neuron has DNA, like we said, right? Because each neuron, like if we're going through the process of how we've talked about this, each neuron has a nucleus, and inside the nucleus, we have the chromosomes, which contain the DNA. And so with that, we assume that each neuron also has proteins. So each neuron has exactly the same genetic code, but probably, depending on how they function, maybe a different amount of proteins, okay? Of the different proteins that are available. And there's like a whole different cascade of them. You can look them up. I was going to put it here, but I didn't want to confuse you guys. But you can look that up on your own if it interests you. And they're involved in how the neurons are formed, what their function is, like where they migrate to in different parts of the brain, things like that. And when they should be, when they should be formed, things like that. So DNA in neurons tells the neuron how it should be structured, right? Where it should go, like I said, and other things like, what should the neuron actually look like? And proteins can be involved in how neurons actually take a signal from another neuron, which we'll talk a lot about, which is a very chemical process, but also involves things like proteins. Okay, that's it. I hope that was helpful. This is just a jumping off point. If you have questions, bring them to office hours, bring them to class, and we'll talk about it more. See you guys.